forward to this presentation, by the way. And you should get lots of questions afterwards. When you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll make sure we get a microphone to you. Yeah, it's right here. Yes, ma'am. All right.
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I would like to take you back to the morning of August 15th in the year 1780. A group of men, about 20 in number, are mounting their horses and preparing to leave General Horatio Gates's camp at Rugely's Mill, some 11 miles north of British held Camden. The men are militia volunteers. They are a diverse group, ranging in age from teenage boys to grizzled veterans of the wars with the Cherokee. Some of them are white, some are of African descent, and a few are from the Catawba Nation. Their clothes are ragged and mismatched, and they're carrying an odd assortment of weapons, so they are not an impressive sight. Even their leader's appearance is not impressive. Standing 5 feet 2 inches tall, weighing only 110 pounds, he has the physique of an adolescent boy rather than that of a 48-year-old man. But he wears the uniform of a Continental Army officer, wrinkled though it is, with an air of authority that commands respect. His name is Francis Marion. In late July, Marion and his ragtag group of volunteers traveled all the way to Hollingsworth Farm in North Carolina to await the arrival of General Gates, who had just been appointed commander of the Southern Department. When he arrived, they offered their services to him, and they had been invited to ride alongside the general on the march into South Carolina. But they are now parting company. A group of men in the Williamsburg district of South Carolina were forming a militia unit, and they asked General Gates to send them an experienced Continental Army officer to lead the unit. Marion, for one reason or another, decided to volunteer, and General Gates was only too happy to send this unimpressive-looking group off to Williamsburg, which for them was very fortunate, because that night, American forces marching south on the road to Camden collided with British forces marching north on the same road. The Battle of Camden took place the next day, and when it was over, some 2,000 Continental soldiers had been either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, and what was left of the Continental Army was in flight to North Carolina. Now, Marion must have been born under a lucky star, because this was not his first or his only escape from misfortune. It began very early at his birth. I'll get it right in a minute, all right. Parson Weems, who we just heard about, was Marion's first biographer, and on describing Marion's birth, he wrote, "I have it on good authority that Marion was not larger than a New England lobster and could easily enough been put into a quart pot." I did try to find a picture of a lobster in a quart pot, but I couldn't really find a good one, so we're stuck with this one. Marion was most likely born prematurely, and in an age when the mortality rate for newborns, especially those who were premature, was high. It's really a miracle that he survived. And then, of course, when he was a teenager, Marion signed on board as a sailor on board a merchant vessel bound to the West Indies. The ship floundered at sea. Marion and the rest of the crew were cast adrift in an open boat for several days, Marion was one of 4 survivors out of a crew of 6. And then just a few months earlier, Marion had escaped becoming a prisoner of war after the fall of Charleston. In March, before the siege began, he was at a party given by one of his fellow officers. It was a drinking party, and it was getting late, and Marion wanted to leave. But he found that his host had locked all the doors. So Marion jumped out of a second-floor window and shattered his ankle. On April 12th, just as the British were tightening the noose around Charleston, General Lincoln ordered all officers without a command, an active command, and any who were unfit for duty should leave and retire to the countryside. Marion left the next day, which is why he was not in town when the Army surrendered, and why he was at liberty to take command of the Williamsburg militia. But fate was not finished with Francis Marion as yet, because having just escaped death of capture at the Battle of Camden, 4 months later, he almost rode into a British ambush. This time, he was saved by the intervention of a widow named Dorothy Sinkler Richardson. In writing about this small but important event, historians sometimes overlook it in the broader story of Marion's exploits during the war. And when it is mentioned, Dorothy's part in it is glossed over. She's given a cursory remark as, oh, Mrs. Richardson. Some historians have misnamed her as Mary Richardson, who was the first Mrs. Richardson. So I think it's time that Dorothy gets the recognition that she deserves. So this afternoon, I would like to explore this event with you in greater detail and focus on answering these 3 questions. Who was Dorothy Sinkler Richardson? How did she come to be in a position to help Marion? And why were the British so anxious to stop Marion's activities in the months following the fall of Charleston? Those pivotal months when the fate of the American Revolution hung in the balance. So let's begin with Dorothy. Okay? She was born on April 15, 1737. Her mother was Jane Gerard. She was born in South Carolina and was the daughter of French Huguenot immigrants. Dorothy's father, James Sinkler, was born in Scotland. He immigrated to South Carolina in the early 1700s and settled in an area south of the Santee in what was then Craven County. Sometime in the early 1720s, Jane and James were married. They had 4 children together, 2 boys and 2 girls. The birth year of their oldest daughter, Jane, is unknown, but they had a son, Peter, in 1725, and then Dorothy in 1737, and then James in 1740. We don't know anything about Dorothy's childhood or the kind of education that she received, but since in those days it was expected that the children of plantation owners would marry the children of other plantation owners, it's reasonable to assume that she received the education and training she needed to become the wife and helpmate of a plantation owner. In the 18th century, marriage was looked on as a partnership, so the wife had specific duties and responsibilities. On the plantation, the wife was responsible for the poultry, the kitchen garden, the smokehouse, and the dairy, in addition to running the household, seeing to the clothing, feeding, and health care of all the inhabitants, free and enslaved. It was also expected that the wife would take over the management of the plantation when the husband was away. So, for a certainty, Dorothy could read, write, and had a basic understanding of arithmetic. The Sinklers and their neighbors were all well-to-do planters. They had a manor or home plantation where they lived, but in addition, they had other tracts of land scattered around the countryside where they grazed cattle, grazed rice and indigo. They had a number of enslaved workers on those properties. The men were active in local government. Some were even chosen to represent their counties in the General Assembly. But they were not members of the Low Country elite, the so-called Rice Kings. They didn't have a house in Charleston. They didn't flock to town every year for the social season. For the most part, they were easygoing, sociable people who liked to have a good time. The men heavily involved in horse breeding and horse racing. Now, in 1752, Dorothy's father died. By this time, her older siblings, Jane and Peter, were married and living on their own establishments. So that left 15-year-old Dorothy and 12-year-old James on the manor plantation with their mother. They continued to live there for the next 9 years, helping their mother manage the manor plantation and the other properties that the family owned. In 1761, James reached the age of majority. He turned 21. And so he was able to settle on property he had inherited from his father. He called his plantation, which was located on the south side of the Santee, he called it Old Santee. Now, in 1761, Dorothy was 24 years old and unmarried. So in keeping with the 18th century tradition of women being useful and helpful to their male relatives, she moved to Old Santee with her brother, managed the house for him, and helped him on the plantation. 6 years later, in 1768, Dorothy is still living at Old Santee, and she's still unmarried. But her life is about to change because she is going to receive an offer of marriage at the age of 30 from Richard Richardson. Now, Richard was born in Virginia in the year 1704, which made him 33 years older than Dorothy. He came to South Carolina in 1730, settled on the north side of the Santee River, and in 1738 he married Mary Canty. They would have 5 children together, 2 sons and 3 daughters. Now, their oldest son was Richard Richardson Jr., born in 1741, and he will play a part in our story. Now, in 1767 or early 1768, Mary Canty Richardson died, leaving Richard in need of a wife. Now, even though the Sinklers lived on the south side of the Santee and the Richardsons lived on the north side, they were very well acquainted. Dorothy's older brother, Peter, owned 2 large tracts of land on either side of Big Home, which was the Richardson Manor plantation. And when Richardson wrote his will in September of 1780, he named Peter Sinkler as one of his executors, calling him my beloved friend. So Dorothy and Richard would have been acquainted for a number of years. In later life, Dorothy was described by her oldest son as pious and exemplary, distinguished in mind and manners. So Dorothy was a mature woman. She was well-mannered, she was intelligent, she had high moral character, and she had a lot of experience in plantation management. And even though not in the first bloom of youth, she was still young enough to bear children. So in other words, she would make an ideal second wife for an older, wealthy planter like Richard Richardson. But why would Dorothy want to marry a man who was old enough to be her father? Well, in spite of his age, in the 18th century, Richard Richardson would have been considered a good catch. He was wealthy, he had a good reputation. In fact, he was one of the most highly respected men in all of South Carolina. He was a colonel in the militia, and he had fought with distinction in the wars with the Cherokee. He was, to sum it up, a man of whom everyone spoke well. And in 1768, Dorothy was in a very awkward position. When she went to Old Santee to keep house for her brother, he was single, but he wasn't going to remain single forever. And when he married, his wife would be the mistress of the plantation. Dorothy would then be in a subservient position. Now, we don't know when James Sinkler married his first wife, but in 1772, his second wife gave birth to a baby girl. So it's quite possible that in 1768 he was already married, or he was planning to marry in the near future. This may have had an influence on Dorothy's decision, but for whatever reason, Dorothy accepted Richard's proposal, and the two of them were married in 1768. They would go on to have 6 children, all boys. The oldest one, James Burchell, was born in 1770, and then we have John Peter, born in 1772. There's a little pattern going on here. Charles, born in 1774, and Thomas in 1776. And just a little interesting side note, when Richardson wrote his will in September of 1780, he thought that he was leaving his wife, he might be leaving his wife pregnant, because he made provision for that unborn child if that was the case. It wasn't, but obviously it could have been. Now, in the 12 years that Dorothy and Richard were married, his duties took him away from Big Home quite frequently. He was a member of the Commons House of Assembly and the extra-legal Provincial Congress. So when these legislative bodies were meeting, he would be in Charleston for weeks at a time. In November of 1775, the legislature ordered him to take the Camden District Militia to the town of 96 to put down an uprising there by a group calling themselves the King's Men. And he went from there to take part in the snow campaign. In March of 1778, he was made Brigadier General. He commanded the 2nd Battalion of South Carolina Militia at Perrysburg in December, and of course he was with the battalion during the siege of Charleston. After the siege, being militia, he was allowed to give his parole, his word that he would not take up arms again and return to Big Home. But he wasn't allowed to stay there for very long. The British gathered up a number of influential patriot leaders who refused to change sides, who refused to sign the oath of allegiance to the king. And they shipped them off, they shipped them off to Johns Island, just south of Charleston. They were afraid that if they allowed these influential patriot leaders to stay in their home counties, they would serve as an example, and they would encourage others to defy British rule. So their solution was just to remove them from the area. But in 1780, Richard Richardson was 76 years old, and his health was beginning to decline. So the British finally relented, and they allowed him to return to Big Home. He died there on September 19th. Now, while all of this was going on, what was Francis Marion up to? Okay, we left him as he and his men were leaving General Gates's camp. They were headed to Lynch's Creek, where they were to meet with the 200 volunteers from the Williamsburg district. Now, when Marion went to this meeting, he had no idea whether these men would follow him or not. He had no real authority over them. They were strictly volunteers. In normal times, the militia was regulated by the government, but the patriot government of South Carolina was no longer functioning. So the militia were free to come and go as they pleased, to fight from whomever they pleased. But Marion need not to have worried. He was vouched for by several of the Williamsburg volunteers, and the group agreed to accept him as their leader. Now, as he took command of his new militia unit and set up his camp along the Upper Santee, Marion would have been very aware of the challenges that lay ahead. By this time, he had probably heard of the disastrous American defeat at the Battle of Camden. Once again, there was no Continental Army in South Carolina, which meant there was no commander to give him orders, to coordinate his efforts with others, to give him an overall strategy to follow. There was no commissary general to provide his men with food, weapons, ammunition, and other supplies. Marion was completely alone. He would need to rely on the civilian population for the things that he needed, and they would respond by providing him and his men with food, horses, fodder, carts, boats, wagons, labor, and information. At this point, Marion was just itching to do something to show the British that the fight for South Carolina was not over. And on August 25th, he got the opportunity he was looking for. At Great Savannah, near Nelson's Ferry, Marion and his men rescued 150 American prisoners of war from the Battle of Camden, who were destined for the prison ships in Charleston Harbor. It was a small victory, but it was one that really irritated the British. And it was the first time General Lord Cornwallis, the British commander, heard the name Francis Marion. It would be a name he would hear all too often in the weeks to come. Right? Now, I'm not going to go into detail into all of Marion's victories in the next 3 months, but here is a list of them. On August 25th, of course, we have Great Savannah, and then on the 4th, Blue Savannah, the 28th, Black Mingo. I put Kings Mountain here on October 7th. Not that Marion had anything to do with that victory, but it was a very important one for the Americans. And one of the results of this victory was that it completely demoralized the Loyalists in the back country. And Marion's victory on October 25th at Terricoat Swamp did the same thing for the Low Country. It eliminated any effective Loyalist opposition, and it left Marion free to strike at will anywhere east of the Wateree and north of the Santee. That's Camden, that's the Wateree, and this is the Santee, so it's this area in here. And that was a huge problem for the British, because Marion was in a position to disrupt the British communication and supply lines from Charleston to Camden. Wagons loaded with supplies, couriers carrying dispatches would leave Charleston here, travel up to Nelson's Ferry where they crossed the Santee, and then headed up to Camden. But because of the threat posed by Marion, this route was no longer safe, and they had to take another one. From Charleston up the Congaree River Road to Friday's Ferry, where they crossed the Congaree and went over to Camden. Marion was like a thorn in the side of the British. They had to get rid of him. It's not that they hadn't already tried to eliminate him several times, but all their efforts had failed. So this time, they decided to give the job to one of their most successful and promising young officers, Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, the 26-year-old commander of the British Legion. The British Legion was a unit made up of cavalry and infantry. Its members were recruited from Loyalists in New York. So the important thing to remember about the British Legion is they're not really British. They're American Loyalists. Tarleton was daring, sometimes reckless, resourceful, ruthless, very ambitious, and always up for a challenge. On November 5th, he marched out of Camden, headed south to look for Marion. In addition to the men of the British Legion, he had Harrison's Rangers with him. This was a Loyalist militia unit, so he had about 400 men in all. He heard a rumor that Marion was encamped at Simpleton's Mills in the high hills of Santee, but when he got there, Marion was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Marion was encamped 30 miles south, just above Nelson's Ferry. He and 200 of his volunteers had arrived there on the evening of November 5th. Marion was planning to attack the British Guard in Nelson's Ferry the next day. But when he heard that Tarleton and the British Legion had left Camden and were moving south, he changed his plans. Thinking that Tarleton would cross the Santee at Nelson's Ferry, he set up an ambush and then sat back to wait for Tarleton to appear. But Tarleton had his own informants, and he heard that Marion was encamped near Nelson's Ferry, so he decided not to cross the Santee after all, but to continue south on the north side of the river. And he devised a very clever plan to lure Marion into a trap. But to set that trap, he needed to occupy a plantation. And on November 7th, he found the perfect one, Big Home. What better place for him to occupy than the plantation of the deceased General Richard Richardson, a great patriot leader and a man who was well respected by everyone. Now, by this time, everyone in South Carolina knew who Bannister, Tarleton, and the British Legion were. And what they heard was not good. The Legion's reputation for striking down their opponents who were trying to surrender began at Monk's Corner and was enhanced after the action at Waxhaws. Tarleton earned for himself the nickname Bloody Ban the Butcher. He was one of the most feared and hated men in South Carolina. So you can imagine how Dorothy felt, anxious, upset, nervous, when all of a sudden Bannister, Tarleton, and the British Legion appeared, so to speak, on her doorstep. She would have been anxious not only for herself, but for her 4 sons. They were aged 10, 8, 6, and 4. And she would also have been worried about her stepson, Major Richard Richardson. He had been a prisoner of war in Charleston, but he had been exchanged in October, and he was now hiding out on the plantation. Now, the first thing that Tarleton did was to spread a rumor that the main part of his force was returning to Camden, which of course was not true, as Dorothy could plainly see. Then he sent out a number of small patrols to make it look like his reduced force was scattered throughout the countryside. He had 2 artillery pieces with him, so he had his men carefully conceal them. Then he lit huge bonfires at Big Home. The glow from these fires lit up the night sky, and then he and his men carefully concealed themselves in the woods and waited. Dorothy knew that the light from the fires could be seen at a distance in the sky, and she was afraid that Marion would see the glow, think that the British were burning Big Home, plan to attack without knowing the strength of Tarleton's force and the presence of the artillery pieces. It's quite possible that Dorothy was personally acquainted with Frances Marion. Her brother, Peter Sinkler's first wife, was Marion's cousin, so she may have had both a personal and a patriotic reason for wanting to warn him. Now, the only person Dorothy could think of on the plantation who would be able to slip away undetected to give the warning was her stepson, Major Richardson. So somehow she got a message to him, telling him that what was happening at Big Home, and asking him to go and find Marion and inform him of the situation. Right? So Marion, at this time, had waited for 2 whole days at Nelson's Ferry for Tarleton to arrive. And on the evening of the 2nd day, he decided to give up and leave. He and his men were 3 miles from Big Home when Major Richardson came across them. Marion indeed had seen the glow in the sky, and he thought that either Tarleton or one of the British patrols that were said to be roaming the countryside, that one of them was burning the Richardson plantation. But not knowing the size of his opponent's strength, he was moving very cautiously, trying to think of what his next move would be, when all of a sudden Major Richardson appeared and told him that waiting for him at Big Home were 400 British soldiers and 2 artillery pieces, And added to that, one of Marion's men had deserted and was now acting as a guide for Tarleton. Marion and his men turned their horses around and they rode straight for Richburg's Mill, 6 miles away, where they encamped for the night. Now, the next morning, after waiting all night for Marion to appear, Tarleton's scratching his head and thinking, what happened? When one of his scouts came in with a loyalist who had been a prisoner in Marion's camp the night before and then escaped, he told Tarleton that Marion would have ridden into his trap had not some treacherous woman smuggled out an emissary to warn Marion of the actual size of Tarleton's force. Grabbing their weapons, mounting their horses, the British sprang into action and rode straight for Richburg's Mill. But of course, Marion was not there. Tarleton then embarked on a grueling 7-hour hunt from Marion through countless numbers of trackless swamps, bogs, heavy woodlands, never being able to catch up with his quarry. Of course, Marion and his men had an advantage. They had a head start, they were familiar with the terrain, and so they were always able to keep a safe distance ahead of their pursuers. But at Benbow's Ferry on the Black River, Marion decided to call a halt. With the river between him and his pursuers, the swamp at his back that he could disappear into if need be, he decided to make a stand. He and his men put up a barricade and they waited for Tarleton. But he never came. On the edge of Ogg Swamp, yet another trackless marshland, Tarleton had had enough. 7 hours riding through difficult terrain, his horses, his men were exhausted. He decided to call a halt. And this is when he uttered or said to have uttered this famous statement, "Come, my boys, let us go back and we will soon find the game caught." That's Thomas Sumter. But as for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him. And contrary to popular belief, this is not when people started calling Francis Marion the swamp fox. I think as our previous speaker alluded, there is a kind of a bad connotation to swamp foxes in the 18th century. It's pretty derogatory to call somebody that. So this is something that I don't think anyone would have ever called him in the 18th century. So this is a 19th century thing, right? Now, Tarleton may have left off the chase for Marion, but he was not about to leave the area without venting his frustration on the civilian population and on the treacherous woman who foiled his attempt to capture Marion. He returned to Big Home. He ordered Dorothy to have her enslaved servant serve him dinner. He allowed his men to rampage through the house, plundering and looting as they wanted. He had Dorothy beaten to make her tell him where Marion was, which is something poor Dorothy couldn't have done even if she wanted to. And then most cruelly of all, he had her cattle herded into the barn where all the grain from the harvest was stored. He set fire to the barn, to the house, to the outbuildings, leaving Dorothy bruised and battered by the beating, and her 4 sons huddled around an open fire with only the clothes on their backs, while everything they owned in the world went up in flames around them. This scene was repeated 29 more times. Tarleton burned 30 plantations in all between Nelson's Ferry and the high hills of Santee. Marion, reporting back to General Gates, said Tarleton had behaved with barbarity to the poor women he has distressed. It is beyond measure distressing to see the women and children sitting in the open air around a fire without a blanket or any clothing but what they had on, and women of family and that had ample fortunes, for he spares neither Whig nor Tory. Finally, on November 11th, having burned enough plantations, Tarleton issued a proclamation. He offered pardon to all rebels who returned to their homes, lived peacefully, and promised to inform Loyalist authorities of any further insurgencies. And then he added, "It is not the wish of Britons to be cruel or to destroy, but it is now obvious to all Carolina that treachery, perfidy, and perjury will be punished with instant fire and sword." Tarleton had not been able to force Marion and his militiamen to a battle, but he consoled himself with the thought that he had caused Marion's band to disband. He had caused them to disperse. He had broken up Marion's force, and he was no longer a threat. The British convinced themselves that the only reason men joined Marion, or that the civilian population supported him, was because they out of fear, because Marion threatened them. And Cornwallis was satisfied with what Tarleton had done, because he thought that by burning so many plantations, Tarleton had sent a message to the civilian population that they were a bigger threat than Marion. And so he was sure there would be no more insurgencies in the area. Meanwhile, Marion was at camp, plotting his next move against the British. So what happened to Dorothy and her family? Richardson decided to join Marion's force at this time. He eventually went on to command his own regiment in Marion's brigade. Dorothy and the boys survived. They were able to rebuild the plantation. Dorothy never remarried. She died on July 6, 1793, at the age of 56. Her son put up a monument to her, which is in the Richardson graveyard. And he put a nice inscription on it, but this is the final part of that inscription. This marble, which designates the place where her remains rest, is erected by her eldest son, James B. Richardson, who, early bereft of paternal care, feels that he is indebted to her maternal care and attentions, to her vigorous and persevering mind of firmness and determination, and to her vigilant and enlightened instructions, to his being all that he is in life. He would go on to be governor of South Carolina, 1802 to 1804. Dorothy's grandson also became the governor of South Carolina, as did her great-grandson. Any questions? Wow.
We have one question.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Can you highlight some of the key sources you used for these, for Dorothy and her family that helped you put this together?
I got a book. I had a book about the Richardson family. I bought it because I thought I could get some more information about Dorothy, but I didn't. It didn't have a whole lot, but it had some information about her family, about the Sinklers, and where they lived, and some of the people they married, and so forth. I based a lot of this on John Aller's book, The Swamp Fox, and didn't have a whole lot in there about Dorothy, but the details of what happened around this event I found very useful in that book.
It was the same question.
Oh.
How you follow the resources there of the family, which is difficult. That's why I'm asking the question.
It is. Peter Sinkler was married 4 times. I think her brother James was married 3 times. So there's just lots of going back and forth. And the records are not always that clear. I checked them out on Ancestry, and The dates that Ancestry gives and the dates I found in the book about the Richards and Richard the Sinkler family are different as to when Dorothy's father died. There were some suggestions that Jane Gerard was married before she married James Symp, and they account for Jane's birth date not being known. So yeah, there's still a lot of mystery around that family, and just a lot of information that's just not there.
Is Big Home site visitable or is it under the water?
I don't think it's under the water. Carol, do you know?
No, from this we can put together from the maps that Leon helped us with, and just watching put the flags from 1760 on. Richardson owned, thousands of acres. And we think with Leon's help that we have the site of Big Home on the adjacent plot to where the cemetery is now. The Clarendon County Historical Society owns the cemetery, and it's well taken care of. The next plot is owned by South Carolina Waterfowl, and they're looking to expand. We're hoping that they're going to research more in that area and find some detail, but as best we can tell from the old plats, it's on that old river road between the cemetery. I may be lying now. I'm not sure which side of the cemetery it's on, whether it's on the cemetery towards Halfway Swamp or on the other side. But it's right there on Old River Road.
Did you look at any LiDAR? You did? Okay.
It's fine.
Peggy, thank you for introducing me to Dorothy. I had no idea she existed. Thank you so much. It's a great story. We'll take a little bit